Where in the storefront, you don't need to be able to see in the big box world. In the casinos, they don't particularly want you to see out. They won't want you to know that you've been sitting there for 24 hours playing blackjack and suddenly it's dawn and you better get to work, right? Because you're not going to be able to make enough money to go gamble again the next night. So the big box at the casino sort of works as the same model as the big box of the retail of the A&P parking. So we started to go out for this first week and we photographed about 1,250 shots of what are the ramifications of this automotive-centric world that we have created when we spend 60 minutes on average in this country in our cars commuting, right? It's actually about 58 minutes, a little bit higher out here. What happens when we surround our retail with acres of parking? You know, there are 7 parking spots for each one of you right now in this country. I don't drive, which means one of you can use my 7 spots if you want and have 14. Right? On average, we take 13 automotive trips a day, not including our commute. Right, we've lost the idea of park once environments. We've lost the idea of pedestrian-centered zones. We seem to have, you know, the thing that amazes me about the automobile is we spend so much money on it in terms of buying it, in terms of maintaining it, in terms of insuring it, in terms of putting fuel in it, in terms of our time that we spend inside that car in our commute. We have more sophisticated heating and cooling systems in our automobiles than we do in our houses. How does that work? It'd be really cool if we all had bum warmers right now, right? And separate controls for each one of our seats that we could sort of, Glenn doesn't like the same air that Mike likes, so you could sort of dial that in right here. We can't do that in our buildings, but we can do it in our cars. Yet at the same time, we seem to be ashamed by our automobiles. We seem to have this little bit of twinge, right? We hide our automobiles in parking garages, right? We think of our surface parking is ugly, right? The only sort of successful parking is when you hide the car efficiently, right? It seems to be a backward sort of mentality as to how we've treated our automobile. The other thing that Bob and Denise and Stephen bring up is that it changes the way we apprehend the world. It changes the way we understand place because we are no longer moving through the world as a 4-mile-an-hour pedestrian. We are now moving through the world as a 40-mile-an-hour automotive driver, right? And we see the world through that frame of the windshield as we cruise through this landscape at 40 miles an hour. We have another curious condition in this town where you actually see advertising that is set up to be read at 400 miles an hour out the window of an airplane as you land into McCarran, right? The ads that are draped on the side of the Luxor, or the big Jim Beam bottle on the side of the Rio. And there's actually another one now. I've started to find that there's, you know, people up at the boneyard with all the old neon signs have started to spell out things for the satellite photos. So every time you go to Google Earth, you see actually the M&Ms and, you know, they've spelled out all their signs to wave at the astronauts and the satellites as they move around. This new advertising that's going to be up at the California border, where they're starting to put large advertisements out in the desert. It's a completely different way to think about marketing a place and organizing that place. One of the categories that I really enjoyed in learning from Las Vegas is called the heroic and the ugly. And I find those two really interesting because you don't usually pair those two together, right? We usually pair ugly with beautiful, we usually pair hero with villain, but instead the heroic and the ugly was a sort of mechanism, an analytical tool to start to understand this place of Las Vegas. Now we know heroic a couple ways. Heroic could be our role models, our heroes, those people we emulate, those people we want to be like, whether it's Caesar, whether it's a Cowboy Joe, whoever it might be. We know that type of hero. Heroic also means grand in scale. It means great big, right? Gigantic Paul Bunyan's gigantic pirate ships, gigantic, right? We know that type of heroic as well. There's another type of hero also, which is about the hero's journey, right? It's one of the great plots in all of literature, is that it's the individual who moves through the world, who goes to a strange and foreign land, and through these series of adventures comes out the other side a changed person, right? It's that other type of hero as well. This is one of my great pairings of the student slides. Right? These two are right across the street from each other, right down on Tropicana in the Strip. They're both about the same size. They're both about the same color green. They're both actually very legible in the way they're constructed, which I find kind of interesting architecturally in terms of the grid of the folded plate or the grid of the steel frame with the glass. And it's almost as if they're facing off, having some sort of debate. Right? Some sort of gigantic symbolic debate about where are our heroes right now. Is it that global corporate capitalism, or is it this liberty? It's funny is that I've seen probably about 40 of these Statue of Liberties lately, because there's a lot of courthouses in Iowa where I've been living lately that have these on their front lawn. They still have them in Paris and in France at certain places. I mean, I like that we have our own as well. I find that kind of interesting. Now, the ugly is a slightly different thing. I find ugly to be a really sort of interesting intellectual field that is really not been explored. Beauty is another sort of topic that I would argue has not really been explored. We are so obsessed with beauty in our society, in this country, but we really haven't defined it very well for my money. To say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder is a little bit too easy, I think. It's a little bit too relative. Right, that we actually have culturally constructed standards of beauty that if we were to actually pin them down and talk about them in a sophisticated way, it might help us make the next one more beautiful. It might help us make the one after that even more beautiful than the last one. And so if we tend to have created a less than beautiful world, I think it's partly in fact that we have not really defined beauty as well as it deserves to be defined to help inform our design work. Now, there's another definition of beauty that comes from Freud. Freud says that the opposite of love is not hate. He says the opposite of love is indifference. Because love is really about passion and hate is about passion. You could say that the opposite of beauty is not ugly, the opposite of beauty is indifference. And really that we are indifferent to the aesthetic conditions of our landscape, and that is what has produced an ugly landscape or a non-beautiful landscape. There's another definition of ugly that I find kind of compelling, particularly in this society. It's underutilization, right? To not fully reach your potential in our society is really quite ugly in a lot of people's definitions. Right, so the lots that are vacant are not really paying full property taxes, right? That becomes ugly because it's not a fully contributing member to our society, right? The homeless are not ugly, as the argument goes, because they smell funny. They're ugly because they're not paying taxes, because they don't have a job, because they're not paying mortgages. They're not contributing in the ways that we sort of expect people to contribute to our society. That's one of the ways that we've started to work our way through this sort of debate between the heroic and the ugly. Right? What happens when Miss Liberty is wrapped up in municipal infrastructure and roller coasters and other sorts of ducks and decorated sheds? One of the areas that the Learning from Las Vegas spends a lot of time on is signage. And there's a great, probably the most important sort of distinction in that book is the distinction between the duck and the decorated shed. Right? In the duck is their shorthand for architectural form that relates to the programmatic function that it houses. So the duck actually, in its etymology, comes from the Long Island duckling, which is a building on Long Island shaped like a duck that actually sells duck. Growing up in the Midwest, we didn't have buildings that sold duck. We went and hunted duck, but you know that was a slightly different thing. But Jim Chaddock can attest to this because he's actually bought duck at the Long Island duckling in Long Island. It's a building shaped like a duck, and you go in and you get your duck pate or your duck confit or your duck for your duck soup or your duck for your roasted duck or whatever on your way home to your nice place on Long Island. So, you know, the Tale of Pup hot dog stand in Los Angeles is a classic duck. It's a hot dog stand in the shape of a hot dog. There's a gigantic wicker basket in the middle of Ohio that is the corporate headquarters. It's a like 6-story wicker basket, and they make wicker baskets. So as you drive by on the freeway, it's like, hey, I wonder what they do in there. Oh yeah, that's what they do in there. But as it turns out, there aren't that many ducks actually in our landscape. What is much more common is the decorated shed. And the shed is really utilitarian. It's pragmatic, it's straightforward, it keeps the rain off, right? It's a sort of performative standard of least economic resistance. And then because of that, shed tends to have very severe aesthetic shortcomings, we decorate it. Right? We paint signs on it. It becomes quite colorful. I like that this is a place I can get liquor, money orders, black pants, right? Donuts. I can get all kinds of things at that place. Right? For Stony, it's really sort of empowering that Stony doesn't have to be able to afford the gigantic 3M produced backlit sign, that Stony can actually go out and paint the side of his or her building to sell jewelry. So we've taken a lot of look at signage. And signage is one of the things we do very well in this town and have historically for quite some time. back to the old Route 66 origins. That's a little better. And the signage, I think, is also interwoven with some other chapters in Learning from Las Vegas about lighting and how this city works from 5 to 9 as opposed to from 9 to 5. And what happens when the lights go out up above, and how does this city sort of compensate for that to create place for those people who use that city at those times. So in this case, I think what we're looking at here is really not a duck or a decorated shed. We call it the decorated duck, right? Because it is very duck-like. I would argue that the Paris is very duck-like, but at the same time, that's not enough in this town. It needs to be decorated in addition to its duckedness, if that's a word. Duckedness, I like that. Well, people will be going back to watch the video to find out, did he say duckedness? Is another, I think, great decorated duck that we have around town. One of the things I find really curious about the signage here, right? We know the heroic scale signage, we know the tourist-oriented signage. Because we have created this sort of purposeful landscape for the 40 million tourists who come here every year, it has sort of trickled down into the everyday landscape and everyday places of the other 2 million people that live in this valley. So suddenly the discount tire store is lit up, right, in sort of unusual ways. I find this a really sort of seductive part of the everyday life in this town. It's actually another chapter in Learning from Las Vegas is called The Ordinary and the Everyday. And what was really sort of great in that book, it was one of the first times that scholars had actually gone and looked at just everyday uses, everyday occupation of the city, right? We're used to, what did Adolf Loos say? Tombs and monuments. Those are really the only aspects of architecture we need to assess. And Venturi and Scott Brown and Eisenhower said, no, I think there's a lot of other things that are a little more common that still contribute to our everyday lives. And if we were to look at them a little bit closer, we might have a better handle on that place. So we know these folks, right? Our 3.3 million visitors that come here every month, these tourists that we always see. I like that they're filming us as we're filming them as we make our way through this sort of wonderful, wonderful place. You'll also notice that this is maybe about the third and fourth slide that's had any people in it so far, right? When we looked at Learning from Las Vegas, it is not one mention in that entire book about people, which I find really kind of curious looking back on it. Right? How can you have a city with 2 million people and 40 million tourists? We went and looked at our photographs. We were about 3/4 of the way through our exploration. We had shot about 6,000 photographs right now, and we had 3 that had people in them. Where did they all go? Did they suddenly see cameras and they all went into hiding? I don't want to be in a photo. They're all in the witness protection program or something like that, and they all sort of evaporated? Or is it that we're not just paying attention to people as architects, as designers, as people, as operators on that world, on that place that we inhabit? So we spent 1 week, chucked Learning from Las Vegas off on the shelf, and just did nothing but photograph the people and how do they use this place? How do they operate? How do we shop? How do we recreate? How do we work? And how are the places that we have designed supportive or a little bit conflicting of the roles of those people, right? So this poor guy on his hero's journey here, right? What kind of world have we created for him to operate in? To me, these are some of the most compelling photos out of the whole collection that we put together. It really became apparent that there was a little bit of a schism of this, little disconnect in the town that we have created here, the place we have created in the desert, particularly when the